Alright, so we've all heard them before, right? Video game stories or war stories from one of our friends or siblings, in which they tell you about the time they've dropped a 40 streak on Call of Duty or Apex. Or the story about how you finally defeated the boss in Elden Ring after 6 hours of playtime. We all love to hear, watch, or tell stories like these. In fact, it's one of the biggest reasons why people watch Let's Plays, to experience the incredible, heroic, and at times tragic story of another player's character from start to finish. And that's where we come to Rimworld, the game that from the start was basically marketed as a full-on story generator. Tynan Sylvester, who was originally the solo developer, has a pretty interesting story of how he got into the industry to begin with. His story begins in Richmond Hill, Ontario, where even as a kid he was fascinated with game concepts. This included when his brother got the game Mech Warrior on his family's 486 computer. When he wasn't playing the game, he would be found drawing different parts of the mechs that stood out. Tynan can even recall when his mom would make him go outside to take a break from the NES on hot summer days, in which he would grab some chalk and proceed to drawing side-scrolling levels on his parents' driveway. Yeah, talk about obsession. Now, his first step into game design came when he picked up Unreal Tournament, and he was inspired to try making levels after looking at the images on the back of the box. When trying something for the first time, we all have a starting point, which usually shows little to no skill, and Tynan was no different. In his case, he says, "I remember not knowing how to move the brush in the Unreal editor, and seriously considered contacting the game's creator, Cliff Bleszinski, to ask him how. I was too shy though." Of course, with work, time, and repetition, improvement is bound to come. And after 3 years of diligent learning and practice, honing his level designing craft, Tynan made it to a point where he would have his own fully completed levels. All those years of improvement in level design came very handy in 2002, when Canada's largest gaming festival, Fragapalooza East, was set to take place with 3 days of gaming tournaments and competitions. The festival also included a map design contest for Unreal Tournament 2003, which couldn't have been more perfect timing, as Tynan spent 45 days meticulously crafting his map, Lightfalls, which he released 2 months before the event took place on November 29th, 2002. The months prior to the contest, the Lightfalls map attracted lots of attention on gaming forums and helping bring awareness to his skills. And I can only imagine his excitement when his custom level design won first place at Fragapalooza East. I mean, talk about the dedication that he had, going from not even knowing how to move a simple brush tool to years later being recognized as having the best level design at an event as large as this. The first place prize included a 3DS Max 5. This was a professional computer graphics program that can be used for things like animation and modeling in games. In addition, he was also awarded the ultimate bragging rights as he received Cliff Bleszinski's Ownage Award to take home. Members of the team at Digital Extremes who co-created Unreal Tournament were present at the event, so you know they had to have taken notice of not only this event in which Tynan won first prize, but also future contests where he took home cash prizes. So staying with the topic of Unreal, Tynan would later take his skills and vision to the next level by entering the early modding community. And right out of the gate, his biggest project would be what he calls the Total Conversion mod for Unreal Tournament 2004, called Elemental Conflict, which was released in 2003. And from the looks of it, the mod completely changes the look and feel of the game into a kind of military shooter, not unlike Counter-Strike, as it featured modern weaponry, jetpacks, and even hoverboards. Okay, now that's something you definitely wouldn't find in a Counter-Strike game, or really any shooter that I'm familiar with. And unlike his previous level designing adventures, this wasn't a solo project, and he led a group of talented artists and designers. During these years, Tynan's passion for not only gaming but level design and modding was noticed by developer Epic Games, as they brought him in on contract to rework one of his previous level designs to make it an official map in Unreal Tournament, which is honestly one of the biggest forms of recognition that a hobbyist level designer could receive. This 2-month project served as his first step into the gaming industry as a contractor, and in 2006 he also received work as a level designer for the titles Close Quarters Conflict and Warpath. under the developer Groove Games. Now, this was shortly before he completed his college schooling at Concordia University in 2007 for computer science, but he had plenty of experience with his level design work and in the modding scene. A game developer getting their start from modding really isn't uncommon, and this was definitely the case for Tynan, as his next big move was getting hired by Irrational Games in 2008, starting as, well, a level designer, which was what he was known for doing best. His first full-time role as a developer saw him working on a massive 110-person team and a massive project, that being Bioshock Infinite. His role included pitching and building early concepts for levels to be tested and iterated on. After 2 years, he moved up within Irrational Games to become a systems designer, which was a bit more technical as his role involved things like tuning the control scheme and AI behaviors, which can make or break the immersion in games. Speaking of breaking, he was also tasked with balancing the weapons in the game and designing different kinds of combat systems to be prototyped and playtested. And if you're in a role currently that does a lot of ideation and iterations, one thing you know is that you have to pretty much regularly expect to have your initial thoughts and even hopes shot down by your colleagues as you learn what works and what doesn't work through proven research and feedback. But one thing Tynan really wasn't fond of was the office politics in such a large company, and how many times after working on a particular system or feature for months, he'd find out that everything would have to be scrapped entirely because of a decision that was made from way on high in the company with little to no heads up or warning. This had to be nerve-wracking for someone like Tynan, who thrives on systems being in place and having clear and open communication with those that he's working with. On the plus side though, he acquired some much useful experience on a team, like fixing 1,000 problems at once and facing other unstructured problems. The other positive was his realization that he really does do his best work working alone. Not a whole lot of time passed before he decided it was time to call it quits there to work on his own thing. And if you're wondering why I didn't mention his experience with the release of Bioshock Infinite, well, that's because he wasn't there to experience the launch, as he had left beforehand in February of 2012, a whole year before its release. The goal that he had in mind was quite simple: to never have to work for a game company again. After leaving Irrational Games, he didn't immediately start his work on Rimworld. Rather, he worked on prototyping many different ideas he had. But these ideas wouldn't exactly be fully fleshed out over time, as his main focus was to create a solid foundation to work on for the future. As he notes that he believes you can find that games work or don't work very early in the process. Now, you're probably expecting me to continue and jump right to the part where he went to work for himself as a solo developer, and though this was the case, Tynan actually had lots of wisdom that he wanted to share professionally as someone who's had years of experience on game teams of varying sizes and cultures. And so he took to writing a book titled Designing Games, which is essentially a practical guide on game design concepts to make better games. Interestingly, one of his first prototypes he went through turned out to be a roguelike RPG that, as Tynan noted, was in line to be similar to Project Zomboid. Stay tuned for that video coming up. But unlike Project Zomboid, it became a bore to play after about a month. And the more I think about the process of testing and dumping out ideas, the more it really does seem to make a lot of sense, as it is far more efficient to know early on that your game, well, sucks, and take that not as a loss or something to be ashamed of, but a learning step forward. Now, the next game also had flavors of another title, this time being what Tynan quotes as Smash TV with magician warlocks fighting in an arena for money, called Amaze. This apparently had one or two too many game genres blended in, including a tower defense side with synchronized music, and he admits that he was, quote, trying too much. Some other ideas included a zombie RPG roguelike, a mercenary tactics game, and one of the last notable concepts he had was one that you would categorize as a sim or management game where you try to fulfill client orders. So the way that Tynan described this game is actually pretty hilarious. So if you played Hitman, imagine if you were managing the organization that sends 47 out to kill people, Instead of playing the assassin, you're playing the people that manage the assassin. I'll be honest, especially as a huge Hitman fan, this game sounded like it could have been a huge hit. But going back to the principles that Tynan was working by, this had to be dumped as the concept and fun factor just wasn't clicking fast enough. From spring 2012 to February 2013, he had so many game concepts and threw them out in such a short period of time. Each prototype took between 20 and 50 days. And during this time, he was living off of his savings, so the clock was ticking for him to make something happen. The summer of 2012 was the hardest period for Tynan. He had no kind of validation, he hadn't made $1, and he didn't even have a website. While prototyping, there was always the looming question of, would this concept work if I pilot certain things? And overall, wondering if the trash concepts could have been great. Am I throwing it out because it's too early and needs more dev time to shine? Or because it's fundamentally not as great an idea that it should be? A lot of games are determined by the early month of development at a basic level, says Tynan. Now we come to the prototype idea that would eventually become the Rimworld of today. Tynan, like many who also tried the game Dwarf Fortress, found that the interface was just too complicated to get into. And after just 12 hours, he had to call it quits. He still had lots of fascination with the game, but just not in the form of playing it himself. Rather, he would find himself exploring the many stories that Dwarf Fortress players had written about online. Some of the most famous or infamous stories in Dwarf Fortress includes ones titled Gem Cloud and Boat Murder, which is a 65-page documented journey that was written by the 17 players who played through and shared all of the details of the beginning, middle, and end of their gameplay. In a way, you can think of it as a written Let's Play, and I'll even link the stories down below for those interested, as it's way too much to cover in this video. But these player stories themselves were the spark that would influence Tynan in his next prototype. However, they weren't the only sources of inspiration for him. In fact, there's actually a ton of media influences. Too many to name here, but some highlights include the well-known science fiction novel Dune. There's also Warhammer 40,000 and Firefly, which is where the Western feel came from. The first prototype of Rimworld was called Starship Architect. The idea, which had to have some inspiration from FTL Faster Than Light, was to build and manage a starship through space, including the members of the starship. But there were two complications that occurred, including flying the ship around and the interior management element. More specifically, the trouble had to do with the way to navigate the crew to crawl through airlocks. Tynan explains, just before Rimworld was Rimworld, it was a starship construction simulator. There was a system where they'd have to go through airlocks to carry out tasks inside the ship. But this is hugely difficult because it requires chaining tasks together. In order to repair something outside, you have to first do the airlock, then go outside. Task dependencies like this are really complicated, and I ultimately failed to make it work. Tynan tried many different methods of correcting the issue when he finally came to a crucial decision that would completely change the direction of the game. Alright, so get this. He took the ship, landed it, and then got rid of the ship entirely. You can probably see where I'm going with this, and this was actually a method that Tynan had done many times before by taking a game concept and stripping away things unnecessary to find the core essence of the game. After making this huge shift, Tynan would rename the working prototype to Eclipse Colony, and as the name suggests, he focused primarily on the moment-to-moment and day-to-day interactions of a small colony. Of course, we talked about media inspirations that Tynan had, but in addition to that, he also drew ideas from his own life experiences. From his childhood trips to the wilderness in which he had to forage for wild berries, to his time in the Canadian Army Reserve in 2005. He reached a point where the game was functional with minimal graphics, and by minimal, I mean simple yellow dots for characters moving about on the screen. He decided it was time to invite his first playtesters, which was some of his friends, over to his house one evening. Not only were they won over by the game mechanics, they wouldn't even leave his house, and even after falling asleep several times, they would wake up for the next turn at the simulation. Of course, this was quite encouraging and insightful to Tynan to see the group enjoying the game, but the next task for him became clear. Find out exactly what about the game worked so well, and how to scale that for the future iterations without losing the core value. Now, that would require not only observation of the game itself, but lots of feedback from game testers, which goes right into the agile approach to game design which Tynan talks about in his book. But in short, in order for him to know what the next steps are in improving the game and adding new features, he first needs to take a look at the prior feedback that he received. So this method is very fact-based and highly data-driven. And essentially, it is a method that prevents him from having more of a self-centered design approach. The first 10 months of development turned out to be pretty incredible, as people were actually telling crazy stories of the game during game testing. So this was a pretty strong first year, and he was excited for what the next year had in store. But even so, he did have his concerns, mainly revolving around the audio and visuals of the game, and he really didn't want the game to be low quality images bumping into each other. Not to mention the fact that the audio was the absolute bare minimum. But thankfully, his friend and extremely talented composer and audio designer, Alistair Lindsay, was available to assist in this area. Alistair had been working in the industry since 1999 and on some pretty notable titles like Jet Force Gemini, DEF CON, and even Prison Architect, which, fun fact, that was also inspired by Dwarf Fortress. Obviously, his services came at a price, and so in late 2013, after forming Ludeon Studios, Tynan would polish up the game visuals, create an early pre-alpha trailer, and take the Kickstarter for bringing on audio and visual help. The $20,000 Kickstarter goal was funded in no time and would eventually end up at over $268,000, largely thanks to the support of YouTubers testing out and exposing the features of the game to large audiences. Perhaps the biggest feature about the game that was marketed was the use of an intelligent AI storyteller that pushes story events to occur based on the player's unique situation. The AI monitors the colony's resources, location, and even relationships to create the ideal events that will make for the best kinds of stories to tell. An overlooking AI system isn't a first in video games. In fact, Tynan partially modeled this after both the Left 4 Dead director that dynamically shifted the pacing and difficulty for players, as well as the random event formats from FTL Faster Than Light. Regarding the Kickstarter success, it's important to note that the whole campaign was done without the use of stretch goals, which was actually a deliberate decision, as he believed that having them would threaten to throw off the planned schedule of the game. In his own words, Tynan explained, "If we laid out a bunch of stretch goals now, the project will be locked into a fixed design with no chance to adjust to design feedback. This would be very, very bad." Everything about Rimworld, the basic concept, the control scheme, even the Western vibe, was created observationally by reacting to where the game wanted to go instead of forcing it in a pre-decided direction. Tynan had made it pretty far as a solo developer, and Rimworld would only go further, faster, with the help of the additional Ludeon Studio members. And what's interesting about the team is that since day one, it has been fully remote, yet prior to any kind of pandemic. And sure, there are plenty of challenges that come with the nature of being remote, but it seems the team found the best way to communicate and be on the same page without the need of a million different apps. They keep it pretty simple. In fact, when it comes to new features in the game, the team shares a large document where they can add any and all ideas that could potentially add value to the game. And this document sits at well over 40 pages. All shared within Google Docs. Each idea that is in a document, and certainly any feature that has made it into the game, has gone through incredible amounts of testing and iteration to ensure that it would absolutely be something essential in the natural growth of the game. This approach to game design would definitely mean a slower development pace for them as they continue to work on the alpha version of Rimworld. But a major update that came in January 2014 included modding support that became a mainstay for many players, as it provided new and imaginative additions to the game that may or may not officially make it to Rimworld. And I know it had to feel pretty special to Tynan, being a modder himself once upon a time, and seeing how his dream game would spawn a huge and passionate modding community. Over the years, the game continued to grow massively, again largely due to YouTubers and streamers, but also journalists who covered early parts of the game that Tynan shared with. The year 2016, however, presented some of the most challenges for Tynan and the team. And it started in the summer when they lost large portions of their sales on Steam by thieves who were stealing and selling off Steam keys on sites like G2A. And you may have bought games on their site before, and I even have, before really questioning how they were able to sell games at such ridiculously and suspiciously low prices. But honestly, it's probably best to pay higher prices on reputable sites, if not directly, to support the developers. And thankfully, the team were able to put a stop to the massive amounts of stolen keys. But later that same year, Rimworld would spark some controversial discussion thanks to one particular article. Many journalists covered the early development of Rimworld, especially during its Kickstarter, but of course, and unfortunately, not all journalists are credible, and some may have ulterior motives and may simply try to find small flaws in the game which could lead to big headlines. We've seen this tons of times in gaming, including with No Man's Sky, and unfortunately for Tynan, he had to deal with the lies from the author of one particular article. In it, she decided to closely examine an outdated, pre-bug fixed version of Rimworld and put together a false story and narrative regarding things like gender roles, all without even trying to listen to what Tynan clearly explained to her in an email prior to writing the article. I won't go into all the details of it, but if interested, I'll go ahead and leave a link below, but yeah. Fortunately, this was about the last time we heard from the writer of this article, and through a lengthy and open Reddit post, Tynan was able to, over time, clear his name and spread the truth of the matter. But negative press aside though, Rimworld really did take the PC world by storm. Looking at the year 2017 when the game had amassed over 600,000 players, and especially in 2018 when Tynan announced that the game had officially sold over 1 million copies. And this was even before the game left its beta in October that year. Following this, Rimworld snatched up the position for the highest player rated game of 2018 on Steam, which wasn't an actual award, but when you take a look at the titles that it beat out, like Subnautica and Dead Cells, and not to mention the universal praise on the largest PC gaming platform, it goes well beyond an award for not only him, but the entire Ludeon Studios team. When it comes to massive stories like Rimworld, many new and aspiring developers become inspired by their journey, and Tynan is not shy about sharing his experience and advice, as he explains that Rimworld hit an area in gaming that was largely unexplored outside of Dwarf Fortress, that players would love to play, and there was little competition in the field. Tynan says, Rimworld was really deliberately targeted at a market that had a need that wasn't filled. I know there are other markets like that, so the real first challenge might not be making the game at all. It's very carefully and deeply inspecting and understanding the market to see where the need is. Looking at the future of indie development, Tynan really doesn't see things changing anytime soon with regards to Rimworld and beyond. The team has countless new ideas that are constantly being tested for release, which means countless more stories that will be told in the community, not to mention the growing modding community, which brings him lots of fulfillment, especially looking back on how he first got his start in the early days as a modder, and even earlier days as an unskilled yet passionate kid tinkering with the games that he loved. Thank you for watching.